Imagine for a second, just a picture, that you are walking down a street in the old city Jerusalem.
Oh, that's a powerful image to start with.
Right, because you're stepping on these cobblestones that have literally been baked by the sun for centuries.
Gestures, yeah.
And to your left, you know, there's a wall that represents the absolute pinnacle of thousands of years of Jewish faith and survival.
The Western Wall.
Exactly. And then just a few hundred feet away from that, you hear the Muslim call to prayer.
Right, echoing right over the city.
Echoing from a compound that is one of the most sacred sites in all of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And all around you, there's this mix. You see armed soldiers, you see tourists in shorts, you see locals buying bread in markets that, I mean, they've operated since the Ottoman Empire.
It's an incredible sensory overload.
It really is. And if you are like most people who are watching this region, just catching it on the evening news, you look at this intense overlapping reality and you just feel this profound sense of, well, historical whiplash.
Yeah. Historical whiplash. Yeah, I think that is probably the most accurate way you could possibly describe the experience of an outsider looking in.
It's just so much all at once.
Because you aren't just looking at a modern city, right, or a modern conflict. You are looking at this geographic space where multiple centuries, multiple empires and entirely opposing national narratives are just stacked directly on top of one another.
Literally occupying the exact same physical coordinate.
Exactly. The exact same space.
And that is exactly why we are taking this deep dive today. Because, well, if you're listening to this and you have ever felt completely paralyzed by the headlines coming out of the Middle East.
Which is very common, by the way.
Oh, totally. If you've ever felt like you're walking into a theater to watch a movie, but, the movie actually started 100 years ago.
Right.
And half the audience is crying, the other half is cheering, and you genuinely have no idea who the main characters even are.
That's such a good analogy.
Well, you are not alone.
Yeah.
It is almost designed to be overwhelming.
It really is. The barrier to entry for understanding this region is notoriously high.
Just massive.
The sheer density of the history, the profound layers of generational trauma, and then, of course, the highly weaponized political rhetoric. It all forms this almost impenetrable wall for the casual observer.
People just get frustrated.
Right. People often just throw their hands up and declare it, too complicated to even try to understand.
Which is a trap.
A huge trap.
And it's a trap we're going to actively avoid today. Because we are turning to a very specific roadmap for this deep dive.
A fantastic roadmap, I have to say.
It is. We're exploring the insights from a book called The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. It's by Michael Scott-Baumann.
Right.
And for anyone, and I mean including you listening right now, who wants a genuine, accessible entry point into this topic, this source material is just remarkable.
It really stands out.
Because Scott-Baumann is an educator, he's a Middle East history expert. But his real superpower, and honestly, the reason we are using his work today, is his ability to take this incredibly dense, violently contentious history and just distill it.
Distill it into something you can actually process.
Right. Into clear, balanced, human-centered narratives.
Yeah, and the methodology he uses is so crucial here. He doesn't just list dates and treaties like a dry textbook.
Nobody wants that.
Exactly. He focuses on the underlying mechanisms of the conflict. So our mission today, guided by his work, is to strip away the jargon.
We're getting rid of it.
We are going to actively peel back the emotional rhetoric that usually just completely dictates this conversation. We are here to impartially trace the roots of this enduring struggle.
Impartially being the key word.
Absolutely. And I want to set a very clear boundary for this deep dive right up front. Our goal here is absolutely not to take a side.
Right.
We are not here to assign ultimate blame.
Because, assigning blame doesn't actually explain the mechanics of how we got here.
It really doesn't.
So we are creating an intellectually curious, objective, and empathetic space. We're going to look at the facts on the ground, the political decisions made in, closed-door rooms, and the psychological realities of the people who actually lived through it.
That's the only way to do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Scott-Baumann argues that to even begin to understand the modern political landscape, we have to completely rewind the clock.
Way back.
Way back. We have to go back to a time before either modern state, meaning Israel or Palestine, even existed on a map.
We're going back to the late 19th century.
Yes. So paint that picture for us.
Okay, so picture the Middle East at the end of the 1800s.
Okay.
The entire region is living under the vast shadow of the Ottoman Empire, which, has ruled the area for centuries at this point.
It's Reeves.
But the Ottoman Empire is decaying. It's widely known as the sick man of Europe, and it's slowly losing its grip on all its territory.
It's crumbling.
Exactly. And within this decaying imperial structure, we start to witness the simultaneous birth of two incredibly powerful, distinct national movements.
And these movements are going to define everything.
Everything. So let's look at the first one, Zionism.
Right. Now, when people hear the word Zionism today, it carries, a massive amount of modern political backing.
Oh, massive.
But we really need to look at what it meant in its genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it didn't just appear out of thin air. It was a direct response to a very specific historical pressure cooker over in Europe.
It was. It was born out of profound, absolute existential necessity.
Break that down for us.
Well, to understand Zionism's origins, you have to understand the centuries-long trauma of the Jewish diaspora.
Right.
For nearly 2 millennia, Jewish populations were scattered all across the globe. They were living as minorities in host nations.
And that was never a safe position to be in.
Never. And while there was always a deep, embedded religious and cultural longing to return to the ancestral homeland, the biblical land of Israel, the late 19th century really accelerated this.
It shifted it. Right.
It shifted it from just a religious longing into a desperate, active political movement.
So what was the specific catalyst for that shift? Because, anti-Semitism wasn't exactly a new invention in the 1800s.
Sadly, it wasn't new at all. But it was becoming industrialized. It was becoming institutionalized, particularly in Eastern Europe and within the Russian Empire.
Right, the pogroms.
Exactly. Jewish communities were facing rampant persecution and horrific organized massacres. The pogroms. Entire villages were literally being decimated.
God, that's horrific.
It was. And at the exact same time, over in Western Europe, where Jews had really hoped that modern enlightenment and assimilation would finally make them equal citizens.
Which didn't happen.
No, they were facing a really harsh reality. Anti-Semitism was proving to be this deeply entrenched, almost incurable societal disease, even in the enlightened West.
So if you are a Jewish person living in Europe at this time, you are looking around and realizing, you know what? It doesn't matter how much we assimilate. It doesn't matter what we do. We are never going to actually be safe here. The host nations are fundamentally, actively hostile.
Precisely. And this intense, immediate crisis of survival is where a man named Theodor Herzl steps onto the historical stage.
Okay, Herzl. Who is he?
Herzl was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist. And what's so fascinating about him is how he took this collective trauma and synthesized it into a tangible political architecture.
He made a blueprint.
He did. In 1896, he published a seminal book called Der Judenstaat.
Which translates to what?
It translates to The State of the Jews.
Okay, just want to pause on that title alone because it is so direct.
Very direct.
He isn't asking for better civil rights within European countries. He is proposing a complete and total paradigm shift.
Right. His argument was genuinely revolutionary in its stark, pragmatic logic.
How so?
Well, Herzl argued that the Jewish question wasn't a social issue and it wasn't a religious issue. He asserted that it was a national issue.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he argued that a Jewish state was the only viable solution to anti-Semitism.
So the logic is basically, if the world refuses to grant you safety in their nations, you literally must become a nation yourself.
Exactly. You must achieve sovereignty, self-determination, and the physical ability to defend your own borders.
It's like the ultimate realization of self-reliance, but it's completely born out of trauma.
Yes.
You realize the landlord is always going to evict you, so you have to just go build your own house from the foundation up.
That's a great way to put it. And Herzl wasn't just a philosopher, writing essays in a vacuum. He was an organizer.
Right. He actually put things into motion.
He was a highly effective mobilizer. Just 1 year after publishing that book, in 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland.
So this is the turning point.
This is the moment Zionism officially transforms from an idea into an international political movement. And there, they established what is known as the Basel Program.
Okay, and what was the explicit goal of that program? Because, as we know, words really matter in diplomacy.
They absolutely do. The official goal was establishing a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured by public law.
Wow. Okay, notice the phrasing there.
Very intentional.
They are targeting Palestine due to those unbreakable historical and religious ties to the land, but they are also seeking international legal recognition.
Yes, secured by public law. They don't just want a quiet, slow migration. They are openly seeking statehood.
Okay, so that is the massive engine driving the Zionist movement, this desperate, highly organized push for survival and sovereignty in Palestine.
All right.
But, and here is the massive historical collision course, because Palestine at the end of the 19th century wasn't just some empty desert waiting to be settled.
Not at all.
There were hundreds of thousands of people already living there.
Exactly. And this brings us to the second massive national awakening that's happening at the exact same time.
Let's talk about that.
While European Jews are organizing in Switzerland, let's shift our perspective over to the people actually living in the Ottoman-controlled Middle East. We are talking about the burgeoning of Arab nationalism.
Okay, how does this identity actually start to form? Because if they are living under the Ottoman Empire, they are technically subjects of the Sultan in Istanbul, right?
They were. But you have to remember, the Ottoman Empire was vast. It was multi-ethnic, and by this point, it was increasingly mismanaged.
Right, the sick man of Europe.
Exactly. For centuries, the Arab populations had lived under this imperial umbrella. But as the 19th century progressed, the empire began panicking. They started enforcing more centralized control and pushing a policy of Ottomanization.
Or Turkification, I've heard it called.
Yes, Turkification. They were trying to force a unified Turkish identity and the Turkish language onto all of its diverse subjects.
Which, I mean, naturally causes a huge backlash.
Of course.
If an empire suddenly tells you to stop speaking your own language and to forget your distinct culture, you immediately cling to it harder.
It was a profound catalyst for self-awareness. Among the Arab populations, particularly among the educated urban classes in places like Damascus, Beirut, and Jerusalem,
Okay.
there was this rising, really powerful sense of distinct national identity. They were looking at the crumbling Ottoman authority, and they were starting to ask the fundamental question of the 20th century.
Which is?
Who are we, and who should govern us?
And their answer was, naturally, we should govern ourselves.
Precisely. You started to see the rise of influential intellectuals, guys like Saki al-Huzri.
What was he arguing?
He began articulating a cohesive Arab identity that was based on shared language, history, and culture.
Moving away from the Ottoman identity entirely.
Yes, and you had the formation of organized underground political movements, too. Groups like the Young Arab Society, also known as Al-Fatah.
So they're organizing politically, just like the Zionists.
Exactly. These groups weren't just sitting around debating poetry. They were actively stoking political aspirations for self-determination. They wanted independence from foreign rule.
Gosh, I'm looking at this setup, and the tragic historical irony is just overwhelming.
It's palpable.
You have two totally distinct groups of people. You have the Jewish diaspora in Europe, fleeing horrific persecution and seeking a safe haven and a return to their ancestral roots.
Right.
And then you have the Arab population in the Middle East, emerging from centuries of imperial subjugation, finally grasping at the dream of ruling their own ancestral lands.
Two awakenings at once.
Both are seeking safety. Both are seeking a solidified national identity. Both are demanding the fundamental human right of self-determination.
Yes.
And both of their compasses are pointing to the exact same, very small piece of geography.
It is quite literally the architectural blueprint for a century of tragedy.
It really is.
You have two highly motivated, deeply legitimate, and entirely opposing national aspirations converging on a single territory.
And if they had just been left alone to figure it out.
Well, resolving that tension would have been a monumental diplomatic challenge on its own, but as we know, they weren't left alone.
No, they definitely weren't. Because the 20th century was about to introduce a level of imperial meddling that would turn this sort of philosophical collision into a bloody, intractable reality.
Imperial meddling is putting it lightly.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, incredibly infuriating. We have to talk about World War I and the British Empire.
World War I is the true catalyst here. It turned these twin aspirations into a physical, boots-on-the-ground conflict.
How did it start?
When the war broke out, the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany, so they were against the British, French, and Russians.
Okay.
The British were desperate to secure the vital strategic corridor of the Middle East. They needed to protect their routes to India, so they decided to use this brewing Arab nationalism as a weapon against the Ottomans.
So they see an empire cracking from the inside, and the British basically decide to hand a hammer to the people on the inside.
That's a really good way to picture it. But the way the British managed this region during and immediately after the war, it's a masterclass in colonial double-dealing.
Oh, it's brutal.
They effectively poured gasoline on a simmering fire by making this complex web of contradictory promises to different groups.
All based on what?
Based entirely on short-term wartime expediency. They were making massive promises that they fully knew they couldn't keep.
All right, let's walk through this web of promises.
Yeah.
Because I think it is totally impossible to understand the resentment in the Middle East today without understanding exactly how the British behaved right here.
Agreed.
Let's look at the first promise, the Hussein McMahon correspondence.
Right, so this took place between 1915 and 1916. The British High Commissioner in Egypt, a guy named Sir Henry McMahon, entered into a series of letters with Hussein bin Ali.
And who was Hussein bin Ali?
He was the Sharif of Mecca, a highly influential Arab leader. And the British proposition to him was pretty straightforward.
Which was?
They said, if the Arabs launch a massive revolt from within to help defeat the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire will formally recognize and support an independent Arab state in the region after the war.
A massive, fully independent Arab state.
Yes.
And from the Arab perspective, did this promised state include the territory of Palestine?
Based on the correspondence, the Arab leadership absolutely understood that Palestine would be part of this newly independent Arab nation.
Okay.
And based on that explicit promise, they held up their end of the bargain. The Arab revolt was a crucial factor in defeating the Ottoman forces in the Middle East. I mean, they bled for this promise of independence.
Okay, so that is promise number one. Help us win the war, and the land is yours for an independent Arab state.
Exactly.
But while McMahon is sending those letters, British diplomats are sitting in a closed room in London drawing a completely different map.
Yes, they are.
And this brings us to the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement is probably one of the most infamous documents in Middle Eastern history.
Without a doubt.
It was a secret treaty, negotiated between a British diplomat, Mark Sykes, and a French diplomat, François-Georges Picot.
And what do they do?
Behind closed doors, without consulting a single person actually living in the region, Britain and France just took a map of the Middle East and started drawing arbitrary lines across it.
Unbelievable.
They carved the post-war territory into zones of direct European control and spheres of influence.
Wait, I have to stop you. How on earth do they justify promising the Arabs an independent state in 1915 and then secretly dividing that exact same land between themselves as colonial property just a year later in 1916?
They justified it through the lens of sheer, unfiltered imperial arrogance.
We want it, so we'll take it.
Basically, they viewed the Middle East purely as spoils of war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement completely undercut all the promises made to Sharif Hussein.
What did the agreement actually dictate?
It decreed that areas like modern-day Syria and Lebanon would go to the French, and areas like Iraq and Transjordan would go to the British.
And what about Palestine?
Palestine was supposedly designated for an international administration, but practically speaking, it ultimately fell under strict British control.
I just can't even imagine the psychological betrayal when that secret agreement was finally exposed.
Well, when it came to light, and it only came to light largely because the Bolsheviks discovered it in the Russian archives and leaked it to the world after the Russian Revolution.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that's how it leaked.
Yeah. And when it leaked, it fueled massive, enduring Arab resentment.
Of course it did.
It established this deep structural distrust of Western powers that honestly persists to this exact day. They realized they had been completely used as pawns.
But the British weren't done making promises.
Not at all.
Because we have to talk about promise number 3, which is perhaps the most consequential document of the entire era. The Balfour Declaration of 1917.
Yes.
What exactly was this?
The Balfour Declaration was a public letter. It was sent from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, who was a prominent leader of the British Jewish community.
Okay, what did it say?
It essentially consisted of a single, incredibly potent sentence. It stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
Wow.
And it added that they would use their best endeavors to facilitate this object.
I am just trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this arrogance. Let me try an analogy to see if I have this right.
Okay, let's hear it.
It is like a landlord who is watching his massive apartment building slowly catch fire during a riot. right?
Okay.
He goes to one desperate family who lives in the building and says, hey, if you help me put out the fire and fight the rioters, I will sign the deed of the building over to you.
Right. That's the Hussein McMahon promise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, while they are literally fighting the fire, he secretly signs a contract with a rival landlord across the street to just chop the building in half and manage it themselves.
Sykes-Picot.
Sykes-Picot. And then he goes to a completely different family who is fleeing a burning building in another city and publicly says, I fully support you moving in and turning this exact same building into your permanent family estate.
Yep.
All while the original family is still standing there in the hallway.
It is an infuriatingly accurate analogy. The British effectively double-booked or, really triple-booked the exact same vital piece of real estate.
Unbelievable.
And they prioritized their own imperial management far above the lives of the actual inhabitants.
So how did the Arab population in Palestine react when the Balfour Declaration was actually published?
Yeah.
Because they were the overwhelming majority of the population at the time.
They were roughly 90% of the population of Palestine in 1917.
90%.
Yes. And their alarm was immediate and profound. I mean, imagine reading a public declaration from a foreign empire, casually promising your homeland as a national home for another people.
It's terrifying.
They saw it as an immediate existential threat. They recognized that the British were legally facilitating a demographic and political takeover of the land they firmly believed was rightfully theirs.
So the war finally ends, the Ottoman Empire fully collapses, and the newly formed League of Nations basically validates the Sykes-Picot betrayal by officially granting Britain the mandate for Palestine.
Right. They are officially in charge.
They're now officially in charge of governing the territory. But how does this, bureaucratic diplomatic nightmare translate to the actual ground? Because people aren't just reading documents, people are physically moving.
They are. The demographic shift was already well underway, and it was heavily accelerated by the Zionist movement's incredible organization.
Right.
Between 1904 and 1914, you had what is known as the Second Aliyah.
Let's define that term for the listener. What does Aliyah mean in this specific context?
Aliyah is a Hebrew word that literally means ascent. Traditionally, it refers to ascending to Jerusalem. But in the context of Zionism, it refers to the massive waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine.
Got it.
The Second Aliyah brought thousands of highly motivated, really ideological Jewish immigrants, mostly coming from Eastern Europe. And crucially, with this immigration came massive land acquisitions.
Well, yeah, they need land to build this proposed state. How did they acquire it? Did they just show up and claim empty space?
No. It was a highly organized financial effort. Organizations like the Jewish National Fund were established specifically and solely to purchase land in Palestine.
Okay.
But the mechanism of these purchases created massive friction on the ground. Often, the Zionist organizations would buy really large tracts of agricultural land from wealthy, absentee Arab landlords.
Absentee landlords. Where did they live?
They mostly lived in cities like Beirut or Damascus.
Oh, I see exactly where this is going. The absentee landlord gets a massive payout, but who is actually living and working on the land?
The Arab tenant farmers, people who had worked that specific land for generations. Once the land was purchased by Zionist organizations, their policy was generally to employ only Jewish labor to build up the new agricultural settlements, the early kibbutzim.
Which means?
Which means the Arab tenant farmers were evicted.
Wow. So if you are analyzing this objectively, you see two completely rational but totally incompatible perspectives happening at once.
Exactly.
Because from the Zionist perspective, they are doing exactly what they need to do. They are legally purchasing land to build the agricultural and economic infrastructure of the state they desperately need for their own survival.
It's totally logical for them.
But from the Arab perspective?
From the Arab perspective, it is a localized catastrophe.
Yeah.
They are watching their entire economic livelihood vanish. They are seeing foreign immigrants legally purchase the ground right out from under their feet, displace them, and build exclusive, closed communities where they aren't allowed to work.
It's devastating.
The local Arab population viewed this increasing immigration and land transfer not just as a simple economic issue, but as a deliberate structural mechanism to physically marginalize them in their own homeland.
You can clearly see how the pressure is just building and building. You have British mismanagement, broken promises, rapid demographic changes, and economic displacement.
A total powder keg.
Under the British mandate, this theoretical tension had to spill over into physical violence eventually.
And it was completely inevitable. The source text points to significant deadly clashes breaking out in 1920 and 1921.
Really early on.
Very early. It moved rapidly from political protests to actual communal violence with casualties on both sides, and the British forces, predictably, were often caught in the middle.
Did they stop it?
No, they failed to protect either side adequately, which just deepened the mutual distrust of the British. But the escalation reached a really critical defining threshold later in the decade with the 1929 Hebron massacre.
Yeah, Scott-Baumann specifically highlights this event. Why is 1929 such a massive turning point in the history? What actually happened in Hebron?
Well, Hebron was one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world. Jews and Arabs had largely lived there in relative peace for centuries, entirely separate from the new Zionist agricultural settlements.
Oh, so this was an ancient community.
Yes. But in 1929, fueled by rising political tensions across the entire Mandate, horrific violence erupted. Arab rioters attacked the Jewish community in Hebron.
Yeah.
They murdered 67 Jewish men, women, and children and forced all the survivors to flee the city entirely.
That is just devastating. But what was the specific spark? I mean, what triggered a massacre in a city that had previously been peaceful for so long?
This is where we see the absolute most dangerous mechanism of this conflict activate. The spark wasn't a land dispute in Hebron itself. The violence was actually a reaction to rumors and disputes occurring miles away in Jerusalem,
Over what?
specifically regarding access to the Western Wall.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's explain the geography here for the listener. The Western Wall is the last remaining retaining wall of the ancient Jewish temple. It is the holiest site where Jews are permitted to pray.
Yes. And it physically forms the retaining wall of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is known to Muslims as the Noble Sanctuary.
Which is the third holiest site in all of Islam.
Exactly. The proximity is literal inches. It's the same structure. So in 1929, disputes over Jewish prayer arrangements at the wall led to rapidly spreading rumors among the Arab population.
Rumors saying that.
Rumors that the Zionists intended to forcibly seize control of the entire Al-Aqsa compound.
So a rumor about a religious site in Jerusalem triggers a deadly massacre of a completely different Jewish community miles away in Hebron.
Exactly. And what this reveals is the terrifying fusion of nationalistic grievances with deep-seated religious identities.
That's a huge shift.
Huge. Until this point, the conflict was primarily territorial and political, who gets the land, who gets the state. But 1929 showed that the conflict was becoming inextricably linked to the sacred.
And once a territorial dispute becomes a religious holy war,
Yeah.
I mean, the stakes become absolute.
Completely absolute.
You cannot compromise on the sacred. You can divide a farm, but how on earth do you divide a site that both sides sincerely believe is ordained by God?
You have put your finger on the exact reason why this conflict is so historically intractable. The fusion of land and religion created a dynamic where any concession is viewed not just as a political loss, but as a literal spiritual betrayal.
Man, so you have decades of this environment under the British, the 1920s, the 1930s. The violence is just steadily escalating.
Steadily.
And the Jewish population is desperate, especially as the 1930s bring the rise of Nazi Germany.
Right, making the need for a haven an absolute, undeniable matter of life and death.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the Arab population is watching the demographic balance completely shift and feeling totally disenfranchised. The British Mandate is essentially just a failed, bloody experiment at this point.
It's falling apart.
And this entire pressure cooker inevitably detonates in 1948.
1948 is the defining rupture. It is the year that permanently shattered the landscape, drew the physical borders of the conflict, and genuinely created the psychological reality we are still dealing with today.
Set the stage for us. What happens?
Following World War II and the incomprehensible horrors of the Holocaust, the international community working through the newly formed United Nations attempted to solve the issue.
By doing what?
By proposing a partition plan. They voted to divide Palestine into two separate independent states, one Jewish and one Arab.
And what was the reaction?
The Jewish leadership officially accepts the partition, securing international backing for their state. The Arab leadership rejects it entirely, viewing it as the illegal theft of their land.
And the British, what do?
The British basically just throw their hands up, declare their mandate over, and evacuate.
Just walk away.
They just leave, leaving the two sides to fight a brutal existential war. And this leads us directly to what Scott-Baumann's book frames as the 1948 paradox.
The pterodos.
Yes, because The way this singular year is remembered depends entirely on which side of the line you are standing on.
It is so essential to hold both of these narratives simultaneously if we want to understand the region. So let's look at the Jewish perspective first.
Okay.
For the Jewish people, 1948 is the year of independence.
Yes. Independence.
It is a monumental, almost miraculous triumph. I mean, after 2,000 years of diaspora, after centuries of pogroms, and coming just 3 years after the industrial slaughter of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust.
The timing is incredible.
They successfully defended themselves against multiple invading Arab armies and finally secured a sovereign, independent state.
It is the ultimate realization of Herzl's dream. It is the absolute, ironclad guarantee that there will finally be one place on earth where the Jewish people can govern themselves and defend themselves.
It's a moment of profound survival and national resurrection.
It absolutely is. But if we are to impartially trace the roots of this struggle, like we promised, we must immediately pivot.
They have to.
We must view the exact same historical event through the eyes of the Palestinian people, because for them, the birth of Israel is known as the Nakba.
The Nakba. What does that word translate to?
It translates directly to the catastrophe.
Catastrophe.
Yes. The events of 1948 resulted in a massive, truly devastating refugee crisis. As the fighting raged, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were forcibly expelled from their homes, their villages, and their ancestral lands by advancing Jewish forces.
How many villages are we talking about?
Over 400 Palestinian villages were completely destroyed or depopulated.
We are talking about the absolute collapse of Palestinian society on that land.
Utter collapse. They lost their land, they lost their livelihoods, and their entire societal structure vanished. They fled to neighboring Arab countries, they fled to the Gaza Strip, to the West Bank.
And I assume they expected to return when the fighting stopped.
They absolutely expected to return, but they were never allowed to. Israel, needing to solidify its new demographic reality as a Jewish state, passed laws preventing the refugees from ever coming back, and they expropriated their abandoned property.
I really want to linger on the psychological weight of the Nakba for a moment.
It's so important.
Because it isn't just a historical event that happened in the past, right? It is a present, constantly lived trauma. You hear stories of Palestinian families today who still keep the physical, rusty iron keys to the front doors of the houses they were forced to leave in 1948.
Yes, the key.
Houses that, they might not even exist anymore.
The symbol of the key is profoundly important in Palestinian culture. It represents the fact that the Nakba isn't viewed as a completed chapter of history. It is an ongoing daily displacement.
So you have this insane paradox. The exact same moment in time produces ultimate liberation for one people and absolute catastrophe and statelessness for another.
Exactly. And this raises a crucial point from Scott-Baumann's analysis. He argues that 1948 didn't just create a new map. It laid the permanent blueprint for the conflict we see today.
It locked the problems in.
It cemented what he calls the fundamental issues.
Okay, what are the specific issues that got locked into place in 1948?
There are 3 primary fundamental issues that make this dispute so resistant to any diplomacy.
Let's go through them.
First, territorial disputes. The war ended in 1949 with armistice agreements, not permanent peace treaties.
Huge difference.
Huge. The lines drawn on the map were just literally where the armies stopped fighting. They called it the Green Line. It left the exact legal shape of Israel and a future Palestinian state entirely unresolved.
So the borders have always been theoretical, not finalized.
Always.
Okay, what is the second issue?
The second is the right of return for refugees. Do those hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians, and now, importantly, their millions of descendants, do they have the legal right to return to the specific homes and lands that are now inside the internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel?
Man, that feels like an impossible question to answer.
It essentially is.
Because from the Palestinian side, it is a basic human right to return to your stolen home. But from the Israeli side, if millions of Palestinians return, Israel immediately ceases to have a Jewish demographic majority.
Right.
Meaning it ceases to be a Jewish state. It's an existential threat to their sovereignty.
Which leads perfectly to the third fundamental issue. Profound existential fears on both sides.
Which makes total sense.
1948 locked both populations into a psychology of permanent, terrifying threat. The Israelis, surrounded by Arab nations that point-blank refused to recognize their existence and actively sought their destruction, lived with the constant, historically justified fear of total annihilation.
And the Palestinians.
The Palestinians, completely displaced and living under military occupation or in squalid refugee camps, lived with the historically justified fear of total erasure and perpetual statelessness.
It is a terrifying symmetry.
Terrifying.
Both sides believe, with massive amounts of historical evidence, that the other side explicitly wants to wipe them off the map.
Yes.
So 1948 is not the end of a war. It is just the first violent draft of a map that is going to be erased and redrawn over the next few decades.
Over and over.
And this brings us into a period of shifting borders from roughly 1956 to 1973.
The region during this era was essentially locked in a state of suspended animation between major full-scale wars. The surrounding Arab states entirely refused to recognize Israel. They enforced heavy boycotts and constant border skirmishes.
So it's a tense, simmering standoff.
Very tense. And the first major rupture that changed the international dynamic was the 1956 Suez Crisis.
Let's look at the mechanism of this crisis. Because how does an issue over a shipping canal turn into a war involving Israel?
Well, the catalyst was Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a massive champion of pan-Arab nationalism, and he decided to dramatically nationalize the Suez Canal, seizing it directly from British and French control.
Which the British and French obviously hated.
It was a massive blow to Western economic and strategic interests. Concurrently, Nasser was blockading the Straits of Tiran, which totally choked off Israel's southern port.
Oh.
And Egypt was actively supporting Palestinian militant groups, the Fedayeen, who were launching really deadly cross-border raids into Israeli territory.
So you've got Israel, Britain, and France, and they all have distinct, urgent reasons to want to strike Egypt.
Yes.
And they coordinate?
They do. They launch a secret tripartite invasion. Israel invades the Sinai Peninsula rapidly and successfully. They essentially act as the ground force to justify Britain and France sending troops in to protect the canal.
Wow, quite the scheme.
Yeah. And from Israel's perspective, this was a completely necessary preemptive military operation to secure their shipping lanes and destroy those Fedayeen bases.
Militarily, they achieved their goals very quickly. But this is the 1950s. You cannot launch a colonial-style invasion without the major superpowers of the Cold War getting involved.
And this is exactly where the geopolitics overruled the battlefield. The international pressure was immense, and it was immediate.
From who?
From everyone. The United States, led by Eisenhower, was furious at Britain and France for acting without consultation. They feared it would push the entire Arab world straight into the arms of the Soviet Union.
Oh, right. Cold War dynamics.
Exactly. The Soviets, meanwhile, straight up threatened military intervention. So superpowers forced Israel, Britain, and France to completely and humiliatingly withdraw.
It's a fascinating lesson. It showed that military victory on the ground meant absolutely nothing if the global superpowers decided to overturn it.
Nothing at all.
But the withdrawal only returned things to the tense status quo. It merely set the stage for what is arguably the most crucial pivot point in the modern history of the Middle East. The 1967 Six-Day War.
It is genuinely impossible to overstate how deeply the events of June 1967 shaped the physical reality of the region today.
Walk us through the buildup.
The buildup to the war was intensely terrifying for Israel. Nasser again closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, which is an act of war under international law.
Okay.
Egypt, Syria, and Jordan began mobilizing massive troop formations right on Israel's borders. And this was accompanied by extreme public rhetoric from Arab leaders promising the complete destruction of the Jewish state.
So Israel is looking at the map, seeing massive armies massing on three sides, and decides they cannot wait to be attacked. They use the logic of preemption.
Fearing an imminent invasion that could literally end their existence, Israel launched a massive, devastatingly effective preemptive airstrike.
And it worked.
In a matter of hours, they destroyed almost the entire Egyptian Air Force while it was still sitting on the tarmac. Without air cover, the Arab armies were totally vulnerable.
The war lasts exactly 6 days. The speed of the Israeli victory is stunning. But it is the territorial acquisitions that we really need to focus on here.
Yes, the map changes overnight.
Because when you, the listener, look at a map of the Middle East on the news today, and you hear terms like the West Bank or the occupied territories, this specific 6-day window in 1967 is exactly where that modern map comes from.
Exactly.
Where did the borders shift?
In less than a week, the geographical footprint of Israel expanded drastically. They captured the massive Sinai Peninsula and the densely populated Gaza Strip from Egypt.
Okay.
They captured the strategic Golan Heights from Syria. And most consequentially, they captured the entire West Bank and the old city of East Jerusalem from Jordan.
They captured the Western Wall. They captured the historical heartland. It was a moment of profound, unbelievable euphoria for Israel. It completely reshaped their strategic depth.
It did. But what did this mean for the people actually living in those newly captured territories? For the Palestinians, it was a total disaster. It triggered a new wave of massive displacement. Hundreds of thousands fled the West Bank into Jordan.
Another refugee crisis.
Yes. But crucially, for the first time, Israel was now in direct military control of territories that held an enormous population of Palestinians.
Which fundamentally changes the entire nature of the conflict.
Completely changes it. The dynamic shifted from a conventional war between the State of Israel and surrounding Arab states into a localized asymmetric conflict. It was now defined by an Israeli military occupation over Palestinian territories and millions of stateless Palestinian civilians.
And how did the international community attempt to regulate this totally redrawn map? Because you can't just conquer territory and keep it without the UN weighing in, right?
Right. The United Nations responded by passing Security Council Resolution 242.
242.
Yes. And this document is the cornerstone of almost every single peace effort that has followed since. It established a diplomatic formula known broadly as land for peace.
Let's explain the mechanics of land for peace. How is it supposedly supposed to work?
The basic premise was a trade-off. Resolution 242 called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict.
Okay, give the land back.
Exactly. In exchange, the Arab states were required to terminate all claims or states of belligerency, respect Israel's sovereignty, and finally acknowledge its right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries.
So give the land back, and we will finally stop trying to destroy you and formally recognize your country.
That's the formula.
It sounds incredibly logical on a piece of paper in New York, but when the land in question includes sites believed to be explicitly given by God, logical formulas tend to just fall apart.
They really do.
And we see that failure clearly because just 6 years later, the region is engaged in another massive, brutal war, the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
The 1973 war was a seismic psychological shock to Israel.
Why? They just won so decisively.
Well, following their overwhelming lightning-fast victory in '67, a dangerous complacency and an illusion of absolute invincibility had settled over the Israeli military and the political establishment. They genuinely believed the Arab armies were too weak to ever attack.
And Egypt and Syria used that exact arrogance against them.
They did.
They chose the timing of their attack perfectly.
Yes, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's the holiest, most solemn, and quietest day in the entire Jewish calendar. The entire country shuts down, and soldiers are fasting.
Wow.
And on that day, Egypt and Syria launched a massive, highly coordinated surprise attack across the Suez Canal and into the Golan Heights.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario for Israel. The existential fear from 1948 suddenly just rushes right back in.
It absolutely did. In the initial days of the war, the armed forces achieved total tactical surprise. They made significant, bloody advances, penetrating deep into Israeli defenses.
Did Israel recover?
Ultimately, yes. Israel managed a massive, rapid mobilization. They absorbed the initial blow, fiercely counterattacked, and eventually pushed the forces back, even surrounding the Egyptian Third Army. So militarily, Israel won the war.
Right.
But the psychological landscape of the entire Middle East was permanently altered.
Let's dissect that psychological shift. What did the Yom Kippur War change in the minds of the Israelis?
For Israel, the devastating early losses and the incredibly high casualty rate shattered that post-67 illusion of invulnerability.
They woke up.
They realized that simply holding vast amounts of territory didn't guarantee their safety. They realized they could be caught off guard and that their national survival was still deeply, deeply precarious. It was a trauma that forced severe introspection.
And what about the Arab side? Because even though they ultimately lost the territory again, they proved they could actually bleed the Israeli military.
And that was the crucial factor. For the Arab states, particularly Egypt, under their new president Anwar Sadat, those early military successes successfully restored a profound sense of national pride and honor.
Honor that had been crushed in 67.
Completely humiliated in 67, yes.
This is a really important concept to grasp. In diplomacy, you cannot effectively negotiate with someone who feels entirely humiliated and defeated. They have nothing to lose.
Right.
But if both sides feel they have honor and both sides are just utterly exhausted by the trauma of constant war, a window suddenly opens.
Exactly. This newly established psychological parity is what actually made diplomacy possible. Furthermore, the war forced the United States into a state of hyper-engagement.
Because of the oil.
Because of the oil. During the conflict, the Arab oil-producing nations instituted an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel. It created a massive, crippling economic crisis in the West.
Gas lines everywhere.
Exactly. The U.S. realized that an unstable Middle East was a direct, critical threat to their own economy and their Cold War strategy. They had to fix it.
Which leads us directly into a new, hopeful, but ultimately heartbreaking era.
Peacemaking.
Right. We've traced the dual awakening, the colonial double booking of WWI, the profound paradox of 1948, and the constantly shifting violent maps of the 60s and 70s. The sheer exhaustion of constant existential warfare finally brings these leaders to the negotiating table. The era of peacemaking.
The massive breakthrough moment came in 1978 with the Camp David Accords.
Brokered by who?
Brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. This was a treaty between Israel's Menachem Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat. And it was monumental because it proved that the Land for Peace formula from Resolution 242 could actually work in the real world.
What were the actual mechanics of the trade?
Israel agreed to a phased withdrawal, completely returning the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt became the very first Arab nation to officially recognize the State of Israel and sign a full peace treaty.
This is a huge strategic win for Israel.
Massive.
By making peace of Egypt, they effectively remove the largest, most powerful Arab military from the conflict equation. It entirely breaks the united front of Arab hostility.
It reshaped the board.
And this initial success really paves the way for the immense global optimism of the 1990s. If you lived through the 90s, you remember the imagery?
The handshake.
The iconic handshake on the White House lawn between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, overseen by Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
the Oslo Accords. There was a genuine, palpable belief that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was finally going to be solved.
There was great, desperate hope. But this is where Scott-Baumann acts as a crucial, necessary voice of reality in his book.
What does he point out?
He points out a vital lesson in diplomacy. Signing a framework for peace on a sunny lawn in Washington is vastly different from implementing actual peace on the ground in Jerusalem or Gaza.
Yeah.
The optimism of the 1990s masked a fatal structural flaw in the Oslo process. These negotiations completely failed to resolve the absolute hardest parts of the conflict.
They punted what are called the final status issues.
Exactly.
Now, the logic at the time was that you build trust first through small steps, like creating the Palestinian Authority to manage local affairs in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. And then, once trust is established, you tackle the impossible issues.
Yeah, it's the theory.
But why did ignoring these final status issues cause the house to collapse? What exactly did they fail to resolve?
They failed to resolve the four fundamental pillars of the entire century-long struggle.
Okay, list them out.
First, borders. They never actually agreed on where the final permanent borders of a sovereign Palestinian state would be drawn, leaving the territorial dispute entirely open.
We'll figure out the property lines later. That's a recipe for disaster.
Total disaster.
What's the second issue?
Second, the status of Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim the city as their eternal capital, citing deep historical and religious ties. The Accords left the governance and sovereignty of the city, especially the holy sites, completely ambiguous.
That's the powder keg.
Yes. Third, the right of return. The Accords offered no solution for the millions of Palestinian refugees living in camps across the Middle East. Would they return to Israel, to the new Palestinian state, or receive compensation? It was just left totally blank.
And the fourth issue?
Security arrangements. How do you guarantee the security of Israel against terrorism while simultaneously guaranteeing the true sovereignty of a demilitarized Palestinian state without Israeli military checkpoints and incursions? They simply couldn't agree.
So they essentially built a house, but decided they would just figure out the foundation, the roof, the doors, and the locks later. And predictably, under the immense crushing pressure of reality, that house collapsed. The peace process didn't just stall in the late 90s. It shattered violently.
It shattered.
And that shatter happened in September 2000 with the outbreak of the Second Intifada.
The Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, plunged the entire region back into an absolute abyss.
What was the trigger?
The specific trigger event for this explosion of violence was a visit by the highly controversial Israeli opposition leader, Ariel Sharon. Surrounded by hundreds of heavily armed riot police, he walked right on to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, the Temple Mount.
We discussed this exact site regarding the 1929 Hebron massacre. It is the absolute epicenter of religious and national identity for both sides. It is a total powder keg.
Yes. And his heavily guarded visit was immediately perceived by Palestinians as a deeply provocative, deliberate assertion of exclusive Israeli control over the sacred site.
Especially at a time when negotiations over Jerusalem were already failing.
Exactly. It sparked immediate protests, which rapidly and tragically escalated into a full-scale militarized uprising.
We really have to clarify the mechanism of the Second Intifada because it was significantly different and much more lethal than the first uprising back in the late 1980s.
Very different.
The First Intifada was largely characterized by civil disobedience, strikes, and youth throwing stones at tanks. The Second Intifada was a war of terror and heavy military reprisal.
It was a brutal, bloody escalation. The Second Intifada was characterized by a horrific wave of Palestinian suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilian centers, buses, cafes, restaurants.
Terrifying.
It created an atmosphere of absolute terror within Israeli society. In response, the Israeli military launched massive, devastating incursions back into Palestinian cities in the West Bank. They utilized tanks, airstrikes, and established a severe, suffocating network of checkpoints.
The civilian casualties on both sides were just staggering.
But beyond the physical death toll, the Second Intifada accomplished something deeply insidious.
What was that?
It incinerated the psychological bridges that had been tentatively built during the 1990s.
The trust was just gone.
Gone. The Israeli public largely concluded that there was no partner for peace on the Palestinian side, believing the terror proved the Palestinians still just sought their total destruction.
And the Palestinians.
The Palestinian public largely concluded that the peace process was just a sham designed to mask a permanent Israeli military occupation.
Total. Profound mistrust.
Total.
So, what does this all mean for the present day? We are looking at a century of history. How do the failures of the early 2000s translate into the specific, deeply fractured landscape that Scott-Baumann identifies in the modern era?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and politics is really no different. The failure of the peace process left a massive vacuum of hope, and that vacuum was filled by hardening political positions, extremism, and unilateral actions on the ground.
Right.
To understand the modern landscape, we have to look at the internal dynamics of both societies, starting with the physical reality of Israeli policy.
Okay, and here is where we look at what is arguably the most contentious daily issue preventing a contiguous Palestinian state today. The source text points heavily to the ongoing expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Yes.
I want to be really clear for the listener about what a settlement actually is, because the word makes it sound like, a few tents on a hill.
That is a crucial distinction to make. These are not tents. Israeli settlements are established, physical civilian communities.
How big?
Some of the size of small cities, with tens of thousands of residents, complete with shopping malls, universities, and industrial zones.
Wow.
But they are built on territory captured by Israel in 1967, specifically the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is the exact territory Palestinians claim for a future independent state.
And what is the international consensus on these settlements?
The overwhelming consensus of the international community, including the United Nations, is that the establishment of civilian settlements in occupied military territory is a direct violation of international law.
But practically speaking, beyond the legality of it, how do they physically impede the peace process?
They fundamentally alter the physical geography of the land. You simply cannot build a contiguous, functional, sovereign Palestinian state if the territory is increasingly dotted with heavily fortified Israeli settlements.
It breaks the land up.
Exactly. And it's not just the towns themselves. To protect these settlements, Israel builds an extensive network of bypass roads for Israeli use only, military checkpoints, and massive security barriers.
And what does that do to the Palestinians?
This infrastructure totally fragments Palestinian territory, harshly restricts their freedom of movement, and severely stifles their economy.
And the expansion of these settlements isn't just a passive event. It frequently leads to the eviction of Palestinians, the demolition of Palestinian homes, and new waves of localized displacement.
Which just keeps the cycle of anger and unrest constantly churning.
Right. Now, this physical reality is deeply tied to the internal political reality inside Israel today. Scott-Baumann notes a very significant shift in Israeli society.
He does. The source text highlights a profound shift toward the political right, driven by the trauma of the Second Intifada and a prioritization of security above absolutely all else. We have seen the rise of right-wing and nationalist political factions gaining substantial influence within the Israeli government.
What do these factions want?
They often actively advocate for a much more hardline approach to the Palestinian issue. They strongly support settlement expansion, and many explicitly oppose the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state altogether.
But Israel is a complex democracy, and that is definitely not the only voice.
Far from it. You have to contrast those hardline factions with the broader spectrum of Israeli society, including the left and center who still desperately advocate for negotiation.
Right.
But crucially, you also have a significant Arab-Israeli population. These are Palestinians who remained in 1948 and hold Israeli citizenship. They make up roughly 20% of the population.
20%, that's significant.
Very. And they are increasingly vocal, pushing for equal internal civil rights, political recognition, and an end to discriminatory practices. It adds an entirely different layer of complexity to Israel's internal political struggles.
So Israel is deeply internally divided on its own identity and how to move forward.
Cyclically divided.
Okay, so Israel is divided internally. But if we look across the line at the Palestinian leadership, divided doesn't even begin to cover it.
It doesn't.
The source text points out that Palestinian disunity is a crippling factor in the modern landscape.
The internal fracture within Palestinian leadership is a total disaster for their national aspirations. Following parliamentary elections in 2006 and a brief, incredibly violent civil war in 2007, a profound and lasting schism occurred.
So they split.
The Palestinian territory effectively split in half politically.
Let's define the two factions. Who's in charge where?
On one side, you have Fatah. This is the secular nationalist party, formerly led by Yasser Arafat. They maintain control of the Palestinian Authority, which has limited self-rule in fragmented parts of the West Bank.
Okay.
Fatah theoretically remains committed to the diplomatic path and the two-state solution, though they are often viewed by their own people as corrupt and ineffective.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have Hamas. Hamas is an Islamist, militant, and political organization. In 2007, they seized total control of the Gaza Strip by force.
And their stance on Israel.
Hamas fundamentally does not recognize Israel's right to exist and explicitly advocates for armed resistance against the occupation.
So you literally have two completely different leaderships.
Right.
One is secular, negotiating in the West Bank. The other is Islamist, fighting a militant war from Gaza.
Precisely. And this creates a situation where there is absolutely no single unified Palestinian voice.
I see the problem.
If Israel or the international community wanted to negotiate a final peace treaty tomorrow, who signs the document? Who actually has the authority to enforce it across all Palestinian territories?
Nobody.
Nobody. This disunity severely undermines their diplomatic position internationally and weakens their cause internally.
And this specific dynamic has turned Gaza into a perpetual, devastating flashpoint. We have to talk about the reality of Gaza based on the source text.
We do. Gaza is one of the most densely populated, impoverished strips of land on Earth. Following the Hamas takeover, both Israel and Egypt imposed a severe, comprehensive blockade on the territory.
Why?
Citing security concerns and the need to contain Hamas, they strictly control the movement of goods, building materials, and people in and out of the strip.
But the result of that is a localized pressure cooker with literally no pressure valve.
Exactly. The text highlights this tragic cycle. It is a state of chronic, recurring warfare. You have frequent flare-ups of extreme violence.
How does it usually play out?
Hamas militants fire unguided rockets indiscriminately into Israeli civilian areas, forcing Israelis into bomb shelters. In response, the Israeli military conducts heavy, overwhelming airstrikes and devastating ground operations into the densely populated urban environment of Gaza to destroy militant infrastructure.
And the result of that warfare in such a dense area, I mean, it's a recurring, staggering humanitarian crisis for the Palestinian civilians living there.
Yes.
The infrastructure is destroyed, thousands are killed, an uneasy ceasefire is eventually brokered, and the entire cycle just waits to repeat itself.
It is a bleak, devastating picture of the modern landscape. Fractured political leadership on both sides, expanding territorial encroachments, deeply entrenched mistrust born of decades of violence, and recurring cycles of devastating warfare in places like Gaza.
Wow. We have traveled a massive distance today.
We really have.
We started with the intellectual movements of the late 19th century, where men like Theodore Herzl and the early Arab nationalists dreamed of identity and self-determination.
Right.
We navigated the sheer colonial arrogance and double-dealing of the British Empire during World War I. We sat with the profound, world-altering paradox of 1948, understanding how a single moment could be both a miraculous independence and a catastrophic Nakba.
The dual narrative.
Yes. We watched the map rapidly shift through the wars of 67 and 73. We've seen the absolute heartbreak of the failed peace processes of the 90s, arriving finally at today's deeply fractured, violently cyclical political realities.
It is an incredibly heavy history to synthesize. It is a century of colliding traumas. But what makes Scott-Baumann's work so valuable is that he doesn't just leave the reader in a state of pure despair.
No, he doesn't.
He actually provides a framework for looking forward. He underscores that despite the massive systemic failures we've discussed, the theoretical frameworks for potential peace, primarily the two-state solution, do actually remain on the table globally.
The vision of a sovereign, independent state of Palestine existing peacefully alongside a secure state of Israel. It remains the international consensus.
It does.
But practically getting there, especially given the modern landscape we just described, it honestly feels farther away than ever.
Getting there requires acknowledging the deep-rooted structural nature of everything we've unpacked today. Scott-Baumann's concluding argument is vital. Peace in this region cannot just be a top-down political treaty signed by elites on a lawn.
Because we saw how that ended.
Exactly. It requires what he calls a sustained and multifaceted approach.
What does a multifaceted approach actually look like on the ground?
It means that high-level political negotiations over borders and security must be intrinsically linked to genuine grassroots social initiatives.
Okay.
It requires massive economic investment to build Palestinian civil society. It requires unified, consistent international cooperation rather than superpowers using the region for proxy battles.
Right.
But most importantly, it requires active initiatives to break the cycle of violence and dehumanization at the community level. You have to treat the root causes of the fear, not just the symptoms of the conflict.
Treating the root cause. That brings me back to the thought we started with, the idea of historical whiplash.
Yes.
The realization that history in this region isn't just a chapter in a textbook. It is a living, breathing entity.
It's everywhere.
It dictates where people can legally walk today. It dictates where they can build a house. And crucially, it dictates how they look at the family living on the other side of a concrete wall.
It is history as a daily lived experience.
Exactly. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as we conclude.
Okay.
We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the mechanisms of treaties, wars, and political strategies. But if a durable, lasting peace requires social initiatives just as much as political ones, how does a society on either side of this divide actually begin the generational work of dismantling a century of inherited and, frankly, deeply justified fear?
That is the big question.
How do you unteach the survival instincts that this history has forced both peoples to learn?
That is the essential, absolutely most difficult question of the conflict. The political lines can be redrawn, but the psychological borders are much, much harder to erase.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Michael Scott-Baumann's work. We know it is an incredibly heavy topic, but taking the time to impartially understand the roots of the tree is the only way to make sense of the tangled branches we see today. Keep exploring the history, stay curious about the multiple perspectives, and we will see you next time.